Hi, I'm Josie.
And I'm Jordan.
And today we are going to talk about the novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey. We are going to be discussing mental illness in the novel in comparison to present-day society.
To start off, the novel is set during the 1960s in the Oregon State Hospital, a facility made for the mentally insane. The atmosphere of the hospital is cold and depressing, with an industrialized appearance.
In the novel, there were a lot of different procedures used to treat mental illness. We'll be explaining them and their impact on the patients.
Yes, the novel brought up procedures such as lobotomy, electroconvulsive therapy, and many types of medication and pills. The hospital also had a group therapy session.
How were lobotomies performed in the novel, Jordan?
Well, a lobotomy is a neurosurgical procedure where nerve connections in the frontal lobes are severed.
Bromden calls it an installation and explains how it is performed by going in through the eye sockets.
There was a part in the novel where it explains how a patient named Ruckley was impacted by a lobotomy in the past. He used to be aggressive and violent, but he came out of the procedure as a completely different person.
Yeah, lobotomy is an interesting one. Let's move on to electroconvulsive therapy. It is brought up and used quite frequently in the novel.
Shock therapy works by shooting electricity through the patient's brain to trigger a seizure. This makes agitated patients more calm and peaceful.
Near the beginning of the novel, the attendants would shock certain patients for fun instead of giving them a shave. It seems like the hospital staff give shock therapy whenever they feel it is necessary.
Harding comments about the impact of shock therapy on the patients. The procedure is painless, but patients never want to have another one again. It makes them feel disoriented, forgetful, and not themselves after the treatment.
Now let's talk about medications and pills as treatment in the novel. They were constantly being given to patients as a daily routine.
And if the patient were to question what they were taking, they would get punished, like Tabor. Also, the hospital staff seemed to use sedation to solve everything.
Another example of the impact of medications in the novel was that some had nasty side effects. The Dilantin used to treat seizures made your gums rot, so Sefelt would refuse to take them and give his pills to Fredrickson.
The last form of treatment we will be talking about from the novel is group therapy.
Nurse Ratched and the staff believe that group therapy sessions have therapeutic value and provide a community for the patients.
Yes, but despite what they think, in reality, it is more like a gossip session.
The meetings impacted characters in a negative way since Nurse Ratched would bring up personal issues of patients and they would get ridiculed and embarrassed for the nurse's own entertainment.
Okay, now let's talk about how procedures and services actually were during this time period.
During the 1960s, most procedures and services that were available were not as harsh as the novel makes it seem. Some of the services used in the novel were actually declining due to advancements in the time period and the deinstitutionalization movement going on. We'll touch upon that later.
As for shock therapy, the popularity of ECT actually decreased significantly in the 1960s and 70s due to drug advancements that proved to be more effective as well as strong anti-ECT movement.
Wow. While the novel shows shock therapy being used carelessly by staff, in the actual time period, people were starting to realize the poor techniques and risks of shock therapy. Now, of course, shock therapy is used in a much safer and controlled manner. Did you know that the use of lobotomies also began to decline in the mid to late 1950s?
Yes, many people just started to oppose and critique the techniques being used, and antipsychotic drugs with the same effect as psychosurgery became widely available. While lobotomies were still used for treatments in the novel, in real life they became more and more rare.
That's right, especially with the knowledge of many failed lobotomies that happened in the past and the advancements of new drugs.
Another comparison we can make to the time period of the novel is the method of patient care. In 1960, they introduced a new approach to the treatment of the mentally ill known as moral management. This approach was based on the belief that the environment played a vital role in the treatment.
In the novel, the environment of the hospital is very industrial and cold. The way the nurse treated the patients was often questionable.
Yes, and it's interesting to see that in the time period they were actually starting to believe in ethical methods and the humane care of patients. This includes ensuring a comfortable care environment, which the novel did not have.
One thing I found similar to the novel that matches up with what happened in that time period was that in the late 1960s, patients were encouraged to do daily work on hospital grounds. It is said that the work provided physical activity and relieved boredom while helping underfunded facilities in basic maintenance tasks.
Nurse Ratchet has the patience to do this as well. However, the nurse probably made these patients work for the sole purpose of control rather than for their own benefit.
The last thing from the 1960s we're going to talk about is the period of deinstitutionalization. People started to believe in rehabilitating mentally ill patients in the community instead of in asylums.
In the mid-1960s, many mentally ill patients in the U.S. were moved from psychiatric institutions to local mental health facilities. This began to increase the community-based care as an alternative to institutionalization.
In contrast, the novel had no mention of community-based care for the mentally ill. There was only the mental asylum.
Yes, and the novel also contains stigma, where people in the outside world were afraid of patients from the hospital due to their mental illness. Of course, like most things in time, they evolve. Doctors have discovered new treatments that benefit the patient without causing as many problems as in the past.
Medication is a major service that is still offered this present day. Nicola, a nurse clinician from the Forensic Psychiatric Hospital at Colony Farms, stated that in the past, around the 1980s, the medication would be stored in large bottles and the patients were given an abundant amount. Basically, these patients were just sedated.
Nowadays, they know how to regulate the amount given instead of just giving high doses. There are still risks of side effects, but there has been a lot of progress in antipsychotic drugs. In the novel, Seafelt would refuse his medication because his gums would rot as a side effect.
Another present-day difference is the value of art-based interventions. Dr. Jeremy Noble stated that there is evidence that art-based interventions are effective in reducing physiological and psychological outcomes.
Yes, instead of sitting in the day room killing time as they did in the novel, present-day treatments encourage being creative. Services include creative outlets such as music and art, occupational support, gardening, and support from family and friends. Other services include education about psychiatric disorders, as well as teaching these patients positive ways to manage and cope with their symptoms.
Did you know that in 2005, a WPA section on stigma and mental health was created with a broader mandate to reduce stigma and discrimination caused by mental disabilities?
I didn't, Josie, which explains why our community fully supports keeping these people engaged in normal life activities. Within the book, there was this stigma towards mental illness, but I would like to think we have evolved and accepted these people for who they are.
Me too. In present day, we notice the problem with the stigma and are trying to eliminate it because they aren't much different from us.
That's correct, they aren't. Mental hospitals have also evolved to making patients more comfortable during treatments. They encourage patients to be friendly and social with others.
That's right. In the novel, there are social events such as group therapy and leisure activities like swimming, but now there is a wider array of social activities offered in a more comfortable setting. Also, families can now participate in the rehabilitation of the patient.
Family is very important to have by your side. Dr. Gernard Hanna has the same thinking. He says that community-based service should emphasize on community acceptance, family involvement, social integration, and livelihood opportunities as a key component of interventions while rehabilitating people with disabilities.
The last present-day treatment we will talk about is vagus nerve stimulation, or VNS. In recent studies, VNS is a technique used to treat epilepsy. It involves implanting a pacemaker-like device that generates pulses of electricity to stimulate the vagus nerve.
VNS is a new treatment for epileptic patients that is painless and doesn't have very many negative side effects. Unlike the medication in the novel, Dilatyne, that would rot your gums, this is a small implant that is programmed to generate pulses of electricity at regular intervals.
As you can see, many forms of treatments are still being performed today, but there are new ideas and concepts that have changed the way we deal with mental health and help patients have positive outcomes. Lastly, this novel serves as a satire.
Hang on, let's explain what a satire is first.
Alright, a satire is when writers use humor, irony, exaggeration, or ridicule to make fun of individuals and criticize problems in our society. The novel is satirical because it points out to the concerns of the 1960s. It satirizes the stigma of mental health, the shortcomings of mental hospitals, and the medical profession.
Ken Kesey uses satire to explain the mental institution as a metaphor for society. It highlights the suffering of a patient and the struggles to preserve hope against forces of conformity.
And it also expresses how unnecessary and ridiculous some of the treatments were in the novel. It brings up issues in mental health and definitely exaggerates the reality of psychiatric hospitals in the time period.
Also, it questions if everyone in a mental institution is really insane. The novel highlights that conforming to the norms and values of society is prized above all else, and anyone who challenges this will be crushed by the system or authority figure, in this case, Nurse Ratched.
Yes, and it shows the reliance on psychiatry as a cure for all social problems. As a final note, it's funny how McMurphy is the only sane patient, yet he is the only one who does not have the power to be released.
And that wraps it up, Josie. We have compared the novel's treatment of mental illness to the real time period and to present day.
We've also touched upon how the novel serves as a satire. Thanks for listening to our podcast.